Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
I was probably around 14 when this first started happening. One day, my mom, my older brother, and I were all sitting together in the living room. Nothing unusual was going on. We were just sitting there when a shadow moved across the windows. All three of us noticed it. That was the important part. It was not something I saw alone out of the corner of my eye. We all reacted. When we looked toward the windows, we saw what appeared to be a man walking up the sidewalk toward our house. He was wearing a dark suit. From where we were sitting, it looked completely normal. Someone was coming to the door. My mom told me to go answer it. I got up and walked over. I expected to open the door and find whoever we had just watched approaching. But when I got there, nobody was outside. I checked. No man. Nobody walking away. No person standing somewhere off to the side. Nothing. The only thing I noticed was a faint smell of cigarette smoke. That was strange, because nobody in our immediate family smoked. I went back into the living room and told them no one was there. We were all unsettled. There was no argument about whether someone had approached the house. We had all turned because of the shadow. We had all seen enough of a person that my mom genuinely sent me to answer the door. At first, we treated it as one weird incident. Maybe somebody had walked toward our property and changed direction before reaching the door. Maybe we had mistaken a person on the sidewalk for someone approaching us. Maybe they cut across the yard somewhere we could not see. The cigarette smell could have come from outside. A neighbor. A passerby. Wind, there were plenty of possible explanations. But then, it happened again. And again. Over the next few years, some version of the same thing happened dozens of times. Not always with all of us together. Sometimes one person would think they had seen somebody approaching. Sometimes someone would catch that dark figure near the windows. Sometimes we would expect a knock or open the door because we were certain someone had come up to the house. Then, there would be nobody there. And often, around the same time, there was that faint smell of cigarette smoke. Eventually, it became a family thing. The strange man. The cigarette smell. The person who seemed to approach the house but was never actually standing at the door. The repeated nature made it much harder to dismiss emotionally. One isolated shadow can be a trick of the light. One smell can come from almost anywhere. But when something similar happens over and over, you naturally start treating it like a pattern. At the time, I did not know what to think. I was not necessarily convinced there was a ghost hanging around our house. But it was creepy. The first incident had been strong because three of us had reacted to the same thing. And after enough repetitions, the house itself seemed to develop a story. There was a man who appeared outside. He wore dark clothing. He somehow disappeared before reaching the door. Then cigarette smoke remained behind. Years later, something happened in the family that made that story much stranger. One of my cousins died unexpectedly. Afterward, my aunt hired a medium to do a family reading. By that point, I was away at college, so I was not there for the original session. I only heard about it later. My grandfather was there. He was not the type of person who believed in mediums. From what I was told, he went into the whole thing extremely skeptical. Apparently, though, the medium told him certain things that convinced him. I do not know every detail of what she said to him, and because I was not there, I cannot independently judge how specific those statements actually were. That matters. A story retold afterward can sound much more precise than it felt in the room. But according to my family, my grandfather came away far more convinced than anyone expected. Then at some point during the reading, the medium turned toward my mom. She said something along the lines of, "There's an older man with a derby hat who follows you around." My mom was confused. She told the medium she could not think of anyone she had known who wore a hat like that. Then the medium supposedly explained that the man was there to watch over my mom and her boys. And then she added the part that made my mom go cold. The man was apparently apologizing for the cigarette smoke. But, according to the medium, he wanted her to know that he never smoked inside the house. When my mom told me that later, I immediately understood why it affected her. The medium had connected two things that sounded oddly specific. A man following the family. Cigarette smoke. The family had been experiencing both for years. As far as my mom knew, the medium had not been told about those incidents beforehand. That is the kind of statement that makes a reading feel much harder to dismiss. My mom got goosebumps. I understand why. If you already have years of memories involving a strange man and unexplained cigarette smoke, and then a stranger tells you there is a male presence following you and mentions smoke, it feels like confirmation. But I was still skeptical. Very skeptical. A few weeks later, I actually met with the same medium myself. She told me one or two things that were interesting. Some were surprisingly accurate. But nothing she said to me was enough to convince me she was genuinely communicating with dead people. My reaction was basically the opposite of my grandfather's. I thought she was probably full of it. Maybe good at reading people. Maybe good at asking questions in a way that did not feel like questions. Maybe experienced enough to make statements that sounded personal while still fitting a lot of families. Mediums can also receive information in ways the person being read does not realize. A relative mentions something before the session. Someone posts details online. A casual conversation reveals more than people think. Even body language can guide a reading. A statement is made. The person reacts. The reader notices. Then the story becomes more specific. I do not know if that is what happened with this woman. I cannot accuse her of deliberately researching my family without evidence. But I also cannot treat the reading itself as proof that the man we saw was a spirit. The older man in a hat part sounds specific, but older male figures wearing hats are common imagery. Dark suits and hats are also a familiar way people describe shadowy human figures. The cigarette smoke is more interesting, but even that might not be as impossible as it feels. Maybe my aunt or another relative had mentioned the smell without realizing it. Maybe the medium knew something about the house. Maybe she made a smoking-related statement because older male relatives commonly smoked. If the reading involved deceased family members from older generations, cigarettes would be a reasonable association. A lot of older men smoked. If she said something about cigarettes, and my mom reacted strongly, the medium could build from there. Again, I was not present, so I cannot reconstruct the exact wording or order. That uncertainty is important. People often remember the successful parts of readings and forget the misses. If the medium made 20 statements and 3 were excellent, those 3 become the story. The others disappear. That does not mean my family lied. It means memory naturally selects the moments that felt meaningful. The same thing may have happened with the sightings at our house. I say it happened dozens of times, and that is how I remember it. But every incident was not necessarily identical. Maybe some were only a shadow, some were a smell, Some involved one family member. Some involved several. Over time, those experiences can merge into one repeating pattern. The man appears. Nobody is there. Cigarette smoke. That pattern may be accurate overall, while individual events were much messier. There are also several very ordinary explanations for the original sightings. The most obvious is the windows. Windows are terrible for judging where people actually are. Depending on the angle, you can see reflections from inside the room mixed with the outside world. Someone walking along another path can appear to be approaching your house. A person across the street can line up with your sidewalk. Someone can be visible for a few seconds and then disappear behind a wall, hedge, car, or tree. If the living room windows look toward a sidewalk used by neighbors or pedestrians, we may have repeatedly seen real people who were never actually coming to our door. The first time, we saw a man in dark clothing. Mom assumed visitor. She sent me to answer. By the time I reached the door, he had continued walking somewhere else. That could explain the entire event. The shadow arriving before we noticed the person could simply have been caused by ordinary movement outside. Headlights, someone passing near a window, branches, clouds, a bird. Light changes. But because a person appeared immediately afterward, we linked the shadow to him. Then, when there was no person at the door, everything became strange. The cigarette smell also has plenty of possible sources. Smoke travels surprisingly far. Someone can smoke outside several houses away, and the smell enters through a window or door. Wind can carry it. Shared ventilation can bring it from another part of a building. Clothing can carry it. Visitors can carry it. Even wood, carpet, curtains, walls, and heating systems can retain old cigarette odors for years if previous occupants smoked heavily. That last possibility always interested me. Nobody in our family smoked. But what about the people who lived there before us? If the house had belonged to a smoker, smoke residue could have remained in porous materials. Temperature and humidity changes can make old odors become noticeable again. You open a room after it has been warm. The heating turns on. Moisture changes. Suddenly, there's a faint tobacco smell. That could create the impression that someone had just smoked nearby, even when nobody had. If the previous owner smoked, that may explain a lot. The problem is that I do not remember whether we ever confirmed that history, so it remains only a possibility. The smell appearing around the same time as the shadow sightings may also be partly memory association. Once two things happen together once, you start expecting them together. See a shadow. Now notice the air. Is that cigarette smoke? Smell something faint. Now, check the window. Was someone there? Expectation increases attention. That does not mean the smell is imaginary. It means you become much more likely to notice it. Before the first strange event, a faint smoke smell might not register. Afterward, it becomes evidence. The shared nature of some sightings is probably the strongest part. If three people all turned and saw a man, it seems to rule out individual imagination. But shared observation does not rule out shared misinterpretation. We were all looking through the same windows. If there was a real man walking outside, all three of us could see him. The mistake would be thinking he was approaching our door. That is a normal spatial error. Once my mom said, "Go get the door," her interpretation also became ours. The situation changed from "there's a man outside" to "there's a visitor coming to our house." Then when I found no one, it seemed like the man vanished. Maybe he never vanished. Maybe he simply was not coming to us. The repeated experiences could work similarly. One family member says, "There he is, again." Everyone looks. Now, everyone is primed to see the same figure. This can happen without anyone deliberately influencing anyone else. Human perception is social. If someone you trust suddenly reacts to something outside, you immediately search the same area. Once a familiar interpretation exists, ambiguous shapes become easier to categorize. That may also explain why the story persisted for years. The house had a known phenomenon, the man. So every similar shadow had a name. That does not make the experiences fake. It makes them organized. The medium gave that pattern an even clearer identity. Older man. Derby hat. Guardian, smoker. After that reading, my mom started joking whenever something happened. She would say, "Get the door for the man in the hat." That became the family explanation. I actually liked that detail because it shows how much the fear changed. Before the medium, the unexplained visitor was creepy. Afterward, my mom treated him almost affectionately. Now, he was supposedly watching over us. The cigarette smell was no longer threatening. It was just this old man being nearby. That change in interpretation probably changed how future incidents felt too. The exact same shadow could go from frightening to familiar depending on the story attached to it. That is powerful evidence of how much meaning shapes experience. Before, someone is outside. Nobody there. What the hell was that? After, oh, the man in the hat again. Same sensory event. Different emotional response. The medium may not have changed what happened in the house. She changed the framework. That is why I remain skeptical, even though I admit the coincidence is creepy. The reading gives the earlier events a satisfying narrative. A guardian spirit follows Mom and her sons. He wears an old-fashioned hat. He used to smoke. He never smokes inside because he respects the house. That is almost too perfect. Real unexplained experiences are usually messy. A good supernatural story turns them into a character. Once there is a character, every old incident suddenly fits. That does not prove the character existed before the story was told. Maybe the medium was genuinely picking up something. I cannot rule that out in some philosophical sense, but I do not have evidence strong enough to say that is what happened. What I can say is that the original experiences were real enough to us. We repeatedly saw things outside. We repeatedly thought someone was approaching. We repeatedly found nobody there. We sometimes smelled cigarette smoke in a family where nobody smoked. Those are observations. The rest is interpretation. I think the most grounded explanation is probably a mixture. Real pedestrians and shadows outside the windows. Occasional reflected movement. Smoke drifting from outdoors or lingering from a previous occupant. Family expectation making similar events easier to recognize as the same man. Memory combining different incidents over years. Then the medium introducing a very compelling story that tied the pattern together. That explanation requires nothing impossible. It also does not require saying all of us imagined everything. Something was happening. The question is whether all the things had one cause. Maybe they did not. That is the mistake people often make with a repeating mystery. We assume one explanation must cover every incident. Maybe the first man was an actual pedestrian. The second shadow was tree movement. The third was a reflection. The cigarette smell came from a neighbor. Another time it came from old walls. Years later, those separate events became, the man visited again. One supernatural cause is emotionally cleaner than 10 ordinary causes, but reality often works through 10 ordinary causes. The medium's statement about never smoking inside is the one detail I still think is clever, whether she meant it that way or not. Because it explains why the family smelled smoke but never found cigarettes. It takes an inconsistency and turns it into personality. he smokes. But he respects the house. That makes the absence of physical evidence part of the story rather than a problem for it. That is exactly the kind of statement that can make a reading feel powerful. Again, maybe she sincerely believed she was communicating with someone. I cannot know her intentions. My skepticism is about evidence, not necessarily honesty. She may have believed everything she said. My grandfather may have been genuinely convinced. My mother may have genuinely felt that the cigarette detail was impossible for the medium to know. All of those things can be true without proving communication with the dead. When I met the medium myself, I went in already skeptical. Maybe that affected the reading too. A skeptical client gives less feedback. They react less visibly. That makes cold reading harder. A believer may provide more information without realizing it. Again, I am not claiming that is exactly what she was doing. It is simply one reason different family members could come away with completely different impressions of the same person. My grandfather apparently thought she was legitimate. I thought she was full of shit. Neither reaction is scientific evidence. They are reactions. The repeated man sightings remain more interesting to me than the reading itself. There is something naturally creepy about seeing a person approach your home and then opening the door to nothing. The home is supposed to have a clear boundary. Outside and inside. Someone approaches. You meet them at the door. When that sequence breaks, it feels... I was 8 years old when this happened, and my younger brother was about 6. At the time, my grandparents lived downstairs from us, so moving between their part of the house and ours was completely normal. I would go down to see them, spend some time there, and then come back upstairs without thinking twice about it. One night, I was coming back from my grandparents' place. Nothing unusual had happened downstairs. I was not scared. I was not thinking about ghosts or anything strange. I was just going back to my room. My brother and I shared that bedroom, and as I approached it, I noticed the door was slightly open. Through the gap, I could clearly see that the main light in the room was on. That did not seem strange to me. My brother and I shared the room, so I simply assumed he was inside. Maybe he was playing, maybe getting something. There was no reason for me to question it. I pushed the door farther open and started walking in. That was when I saw something move. It was small, dark, almost like a little black mass. I did not get a detailed look at it. It moved too quickly. But I saw it dart across part of the room and disappear behind this massive wooden table we had. The table was large enough that there was a considerable empty space behind and underneath it. A child could easily hide there. The instant I saw the dark shape move behind it, I thought of my brother. There was no fear. That is one of the strangest details when I remember it now. Nothing about the situation immediately felt supernatural. My brother and I used to hide from each other and try to scare one another. So my brain recognized a familiar game. He is hiding behind the table. He is going to jump out at me. Simple. But almost immediately after the dark shape disappeared behind the table, the entire room went dark. The main light shut off. The whole sequence happened extremely fast. Even now, when I picture it, I remember the movement and the light going out almost as one event. Something runs behind the table. Darkness. It must have happened within a second or so. Yet 8-year-old me still did not immediately panic. If anything, the darkness reinforced the prank explanation. Of course, my brother had turned off the light. He was trying to scare me. I remember thinking that in a completely normal way. I reached for the light switch and turned the room light back on. Then I went directly toward the table. I was expecting to find my brother crouched behind it, probably trying not to laugh. There was nobody there. That was when the experience became confusing. I checked properly. The space behind the table was empty. I looked underneath. Nothing. I searched around the room. Behind furniture. Around the beds. Anywhere a 6-year-old could hide. My brother was not there. At first, I thought he must have somehow slipped past me. But that did not make sense. I had been standing right near the doorway. The light switch was also right beside that door. The dark shape had moved toward the opposite side of the room, behind the table. For someone to turn the light off manually, they would have needed to be near the switch. Then they would have had to cross the room incredibly quickly and get behind the table. Or, if they had already been behind the table, they would somehow have needed to switch off a light from across the room. Neither matched what I remembered seeing. Still, I was only 8. I was not doing a crime scene reconstruction. I was mostly confused. I kept looking. Maybe my brother had found another hiding place. Maybe I had missed him. But the longer I searched, the more obvious it became that I was alone. Eventually, I left the bedroom and went into the living room. My parents were there, and sitting right beside them was my brother. He was watching a movie with them. I stopped. I asked him if he had just been in our room. He said no. He had been sitting there watching the movie. I looked at my mom. She confirmed it. According to her, he had been there with them the whole time. That was the moment I genuinely did not know what to think. I had not simply heard a noise and assumed it was him. I had seen something move. I had watched it disappear behind the table. The bedroom light had gone out immediately afterward. And the entire time, apparently, my brother had been in another room with our parents. The confusion I felt is actually what I remember most strongly. I do not remember screaming. I do not remember refusing to sleep in the bedroom. I do not remember some huge family panic afterward. I just remember standing there trying to fit two things together that did not fit. I saw my brother hide behind the table. My brother had never been there. Of course, looking back now, I can see that the first statement contains an assumption. I did not actually see my brother's face. I saw a small black shape and assumed it was him. That distinction is important. At 8 years old, the assumption happened so quickly that it became part of the perception. Small shape in shared bedroom. Moves behind hiding spot. Therefore, brother. But what I actually saw may have been much less specific. A shadow. An object falling. A piece of clothing moving. Something changing position as I entered the room. The light going out may also have made the movement seem darker and more solid in memory than it really was. One ordinary possibility is that something in the room shifted or fell at almost the same moment the light failed. Maybe a hanging coat slipped. Maybe a blanket moved. Maybe some object near the table fell into the darker space behind it. Because I expected my brother to be inside, I interpreted the movement as a person ducking out of sight. Then, the bulb went out. Those two unrelated events happened so close together that my brain connected them. That explanation is much less dramatic, but it fits. The light itself could have gone out for several ordinary reasons. A loose bulb, a failing bulb, a faulty switch, a brief electrical interruption, a loose connection in the fixture. At 8, I would not know the difference between someone switching a light off and a bulb briefly losing power. The room would simply go dark. If I later turned the switch and the light came back on, I would naturally assume the switch had been changed. But depending on the fixture, moving the switch could restore a weak connection. Or the bulb may simply have flickered off and returned. Maybe I instinctively flipped the switch twice. Those little details are difficult to reconstruct years later. If the light went out because of an electrical issue, then nobody needed to be standing beside the switch. That removes one of the impossible parts. The other issue is the black mass. I was entering a lit room from another area of the house. My angle was changing as I pushed through the doorway. Furniture can appear to move when your perspective changes. Something that was partly hidden by the edge of the door frame may suddenly become visible as you step forward, then disappear behind a larger object from the new angle. To the eyes, that can look like an object physically darting behind something. But the thing itself never moved. I did. Imagine a dark coat hanging on the back of a chair. From the hallway, you cannot see it. As you enter, its edge appears. You continue moving. The table blocks it. For less than a second, you see a dark form seem to cross the gap and vanish. If the room light then fails at almost the exact moment, the brain has very little visual information to correct the interpretation. It stores something ran behind the table. That is possible. It may even explain why I never saw a face, clothing, arms, or legs. The memory is of a mass, not a clearly defined person. That makes visual misinterpretation much easier to imagine. There is also the possibility of an actual animal, a cat, if one could have been in the house, a large rat, some other small animal. Something moving low and fast across a bedroom could look like a dark mass. It could disappear behind the table and then move somewhere else while the lights were off. But there is no mention of an animal being found, and I do not remember anything else suggesting one was there. So I would not put that explanation very high without more evidence. The light going out at the same moment would still be coincidence. Another possibility is a passing shadow, headlights from outside. Someone walking past the window, a branch moving. If outside light entered the bedroom at the right angle, a shadow could travel quickly across the floor or wall and seem to disappear behind the table. Then, perhaps the main light flickered off. Because I saw the movement inside the room rather than on a flat surface, I remember it as a three-dimensional mass. That kind of depth mistake is easy in peripheral vision, especially for a child who is not expecting anything unusual. The fact that I initially thought it was my brother actually makes this explanation more plausible to me. I was not staring directly at the shape, trying to identify it. I was casually entering the room. My brain made a fast classification. Brother hiding. Only after I discovered nobody behind the table did the event become strange. By then, the visual moment was already gone. I could not go back and look more carefully. The most interesting part is the timing. I remember the figure moving behind the table and the light shutting off almost immediately. When two things happen within a second, the mind naturally assumes one caused the other. The person hid and turned off the light. But maybe the sequence was not physically connected at all. A loose bulb flickered. The sudden shift in illumination created the appearance of movement. That could reverse the relationship entirely. Instead of something moved, then the room went dark, it could have been the lighting changed while I was moving. And that change looked like a dark object moving across the room. That is an important possibility. When a light goes out, shadows expand instantly. Objects that had been lit disappear into darkness. If the bulb flickered before fully going out, the room might produce what looks like a black shape darting across part of it. At 8, I would experience that as an object. The brain is extremely good at detecting movement, sometimes too good. A rapid change in light is often interpreted as something passing between you and the source. That is why moving shadows can feel alive. Maybe the mass and the blackout were really one electrical event. The bulb flickered. A shadow changed. My brain interpreted the change as my brother running behind the table. Then, darkness. I turned the light back on. Nothing there. That explanation is surprisingly neat. It also removes the impossible need for anyone to reach the light switch. The room itself changed visually. Nobody touched anything. There is still my mother's confirmation that my brother had been with them. That is useful because it rules out the simplest prank explanation, at least if everyone's memory is accurate. Could my brother have briefly left the living room without my mom noticing? Maybe. Children move around. A parent watching a movie might not track a 6-year-old every second. Maybe he did run into the bedroom, tried to scare me, then somehow slipped away. But physically, the timing seems difficult. I would have needed to lose track of him during the darkness. He might have crouched behind the table, then run out while I was reaching for the switch. If the room was completely dark, I might not see him pass. But I probably would hear him. And if the switch was right beside the only doorway, he would need to pass very close to me. That makes it less likely. He also denied it. Children do lie about pranks, of course. He might have found it funny to never confess. But my mom said he had been sitting with them. That makes the prank theory weaker. Still, the whole time is one of those phrases that can become more absolute in memory. Maybe Mom meant he has been here for a while. Not literally. I have kept continuous visual contact with him every second. If he had slipped away for 30 seconds earlier, she may not have noticed. Years later, the memory becomes, Mom confirmed he was there the entire time. That is possible. The layout matters too. I remember it as impossible for him to turn off the light and reach the table under a second. But was the switch definitely where I remember? Was there another switch? A cord? A lamp? Could someone near the table control the light somehow? Were there 2 doorways? Probably not. But childhood memories simplify rooms. We remember the parts relevant to the event. Door, switch, table, the exact distances become less reliable. If I could see a floor plan now, maybe there would be a route I have forgotten. Still, I do not think I need my brother to explain it. A visual error plus light failure is simpler. The fact that I searched the room afterward and found nothing is exactly what I would expect if there had never been a person there. It is also significant that nothing else happened. The dark mass did not reappear. No voice, no touch. Nothing moved afterward. The room was simply empty. That strongly favors a brief misperception. If some unknown physical figure had deliberately hidden, where did it go? There was nowhere obvious. The event only works as something paranormal if I assume it could vanish. That is a much bigger assumption than saying the visual impression was wrong. The memory itself may have changed too. I almost forgot the incident. That tells me it was not something I spent every day rehearsing for years. When a childhood memory returns later, some details can be reconstructed rather than preserved continuously. The core is probably stable. Entering room. Light on. Dark movement. Light out. Nobody behind table. Brother elsewhere. But exact speed may be less reliable. It happened in under 1 second, maybe a later estimate. At 8, I was not holding a stopwatch. Maybe there were 3 or 4 seconds between the movement and darkness. That would still feel immediate. Maybe I stood there briefly. Maybe the light flickered. Maybe the shape moved slower than I remember. Fear and surprise compressed time. Even though I say it felt normal at first, the confusion afterward may have sharpened the sequence. The brain loves clean cause and effect. Movement, darkness, search, empty, brother elsewhere. That becomes the story. Real events are often messier. I may have been approaching the door while the light was already flickering. I may have seen a dark object from the corner of my eye. The room went dark. My mind decided Brother Prank. Then I turned the light back on and searched. That version is completely ordinary, but because I never found the object that created the first shape, the interpretation never got corrected. That is what keeps it eerie. If I had turned on the light and seen a coat fallen behind the table, I would probably have forgotten the entire thing. If I discovered the bulb was loose, same. If my brother jumped out laughing, mystery solved. Instead, every normal explanation was missing in the moment. Nothing behind table. Brother with parents. No one admitting a prank. So the original image remained untouched. I can still understand 8-year-old me saying, but I saw him. Except I did not see him. I saw something I thought was him. That difference is where most of the explanation probably lies. There is also something psychologically powerful about seeing a familiar person where they cannot be. It is more unsettling than seeing a random shadow. If I had thought that looked like a bag moving, then found nothing, maybe I would shrug. But I thought, my brother. Then found my actual brother somewhere else. Now it feels like a duplicate, even though the visual evidence never established identity. My expectations supplied it. The shared bedroom made that expectation especially strong. Main light on. Brother probably inside. Dark-shaped child-sized. Brother likes pranks. Everything pointed toward him before I even looked carefully. This is how perception normally works. The brain uses context to identify incomplete information. Most of the time, it is useful. If you see a familiar coat moving through your house, you assume family member before inspecting the face. Usually, you are right. That night, apparently, I was not. My assumption was reasonable. It just may have been wrong. One thing I do not think is necessary is any idea of a double of my brother. The story can sound like that in retrospect. I saw something shaped enough like him to assume it was him, while the real brother was elsewhere. But there was no clear face, no conversation, no direct copy. Calling it a double adds information that was never actually observed. The original experience was vaguer, a small black mass. That is much easier to explain naturally. The sudden darkness is still a great horror story detail, but electrically, it is ordinary. Bulbs fail. Connections flicker. And sometimes they do it at exactly the moment that makes everything else feel intentional. Coincidence is difficult to accept when timing is perfect. But perfect timing happens somewhere all the time. If the bulb had gone out 10 minutes earlier, I would remember only a bad light. If the shadow had appeared 10 minutes later, I might remember only a weird shape. Because they happened together, they became one event. That is how ordinary coincidences become extraordinary memories. I also wonder whether switching the light back on somehow reset the bulb. Maybe it was a loose, incandescent bulb. Maybe the filament temporarily broke contact and then reconnected when power cycled. Maybe the switch itself was worn. A child would never inspect that. If the light worked afterward, everyone would forget about it. So there would be no later evidence. I cannot prove that happened. But it is far more plausible than something physically turning the room dark and disappearing. What I appreciate about the memory now is how calm I initially was. That tells me the first visual stimulus fit perfectly into ordinary life. I did not think, there is a creature in my room. I thought, my annoying little brother is hiding. Only afterward did the impossible interpretation appear. That pattern often points toward misidentification rather than something objectively bizarre. The strange thing was not the shape itself. It was learning that the person I thought I had seen could not have been there. The mind then upgrades the original sighting. Instead of something moved, it becomes I saw someone. Instead of the light went out, it becomes, the figure turned off the light. Instead of, nobody was behind the table, it becomes, the figure disappeared. Those conclusions make sense narratively, but they go beyond what I directly observed. Separating observation from interpretation makes the event much easier to live with. Observation, the room was lit. I entered. I saw a small, dark shape seem to move behind the table. The light went out. I turned it back on. There was nobody behind the table. My brother was in the living room. Interpretation, something that looked like my brother hid and somehow vanished. The first set is strange but explainable. The second is paranormal. That distinction matters. I still believe I saw movement. I do not think I invented the entire experience. There was probably some real visual change. A shadow, object, light flicker, maybe even an animal. What I no longer think I can say with certainty is that the thing was a person. I never saw enough. And because the light failed immediately afterward, I lost the chance to inspect it. That is exactly how ambiguous sightings survive. They end before the eyes can correct them. It is also possible that the room was not as brightly lit as I remember. Maybe the main light was on, but dim. Maybe I was looking through a narrow doorway. Maybe coming from my grandparents' brighter downstairs space affected my night vision. If the bedroom lighting was uneven, a child-sized shadow could appear easily. The massive wooden table would create a large, dark area behind it. Anything entering that shadow would seem to disappear completely. That made it an ideal place for my brain to imagine my brother hiding. And because my brother actually did hide there sometimes, the association was already built. I do not know whether he had used that exact hiding spot before, but I remember we often hid and tried to scare each other. So the behavior was familiar. That means my brain did not need much evidence. A fast shape was enough. I think the simplest explanation is probably some combination of those things. A dark object or shifting shadow appeared to move as I entered. The room light failed or flickered at nearly the same moment. I interpreted the movement as my brother because that fit the context. I turned the light back on and searched. Nothing. Then, discovering him in the living room transformed a mundane perceptual error into an unforgettable mystery. Sometimes I get this sudden icy feeling of dread for no obvious reason. It is not exactly the same as being scared of something I can see. There is usually no person threatening me, no loud noise, no obvious danger. It is more like my body reacts first. I will be standing near a dark doorway, walking through a store, entering a room, or doing something completely ordinary. And suddenly every part of me seems to say the same thing. Something is wrong. My stomach drops. My skin feels cold. I get that prickling feeling along my arms and the back of my neck. Sometimes the fear is strong enough that I almost freeze. For a long time, I assumed I was simply jumpy. I have always been the kind of person who notices atmosphere. A dark doorway looks darker than it should. A quiet hallway feels too quiet. A stranger standing somewhere catches my attention for reasons I cannot immediately explain. Most of the time, nothing happens. So I learned to ignore the feeling. I would tell myself I was being dramatic, overthinking, scaring myself. Then something happened one night at work that made me question that. At the time, I worked in a nursing home. By then, I had been working there for almost a year, long enough that I knew the normal rhythm of the place at night. Nursing homes after midnight have a completely different atmosphere than they do during the day. During the day, there are conversations everywhere. Televisions, visitors, staff moving around, meals, activities, people asking questions, phones ringing. At 3 in the morning, most of that disappears. The hallways become extremely quiet. The lights are dimmer. Machines make small, repetitive noises. You hear carts rolling from far away. A door opening 2 hallways over sounds much louder than it should. You also learn the residents' routines. You know who sleeps through the night, who wakes frequently, who calls for help, who needs assistance turning over, who tends to remove their blankets, who gets confused after waking. And you especially know which residents can and cannot safely get out of bed without assistance. Most of the people I worked around were not independently wandering the hallways at night. Some could not get out of bed without help at all. During almost a year of working there, I had never walked into a room and unexpectedly found one of those residents strolling around as though they had simply decided to go for a walk. I had never found anyone mysteriously missing from bed, no dramatic falls, no one suddenly standing in a dark corner. Usually, I opened a door, and there they were, under the sheets, exactly where I expected. That predictability becomes part of your mental map. You stop consciously thinking, this resident should be in bed. You simply know it. One night, sometime around 3 in the morning, I was walking toward one resident's room. I do not remember anything unusual happening before that. No alarm, no crash, nobody calling out, nothing that should have warned me. I approached the door like I had countless other times. Then, just before I opened it, that feeling hit me. Cold, immediate, that same deep sense of dread I sometimes get in completely unrelated places. Something is wrong. I stopped. I remember standing there for a second with my hand near the door. I did not know why I had stopped. There was nothing visible through the door that I remember. No sound coming from the room. But my body did not want me to go in. That is the strange part. Normally, I would open the door automatically. Routine. Check resident. Do what I needed to do. Leave instead, I stood outside, feeling as if I was about to find something I did not want to find. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. This was work. There was a resident in there who might need something. I opened the door. The bed was empty. My brain did not understand what I was seeing at first. I looked at the mattress. Blankets, pillow, no person. For a split second, I thought I had entered the wrong room. That would have been easier. But I had not. I knew whose room it was. And this resident was not someone I expected to simply climb out of bed and wander around by herself. That immediately made the cold feeling stronger. Then, I noticed movement. She was in the room. She was walking. Or trying to. She was shuffling around slowly in the dim light. Her skin looked incredibly pale. Her arms were bent and held awkwardly against her body, almost drawn upward toward her chest. The position made me think of the short, bent arms of a T-Rex. It sounds funny when I describe it that way now. At 3 in the morning, standing in a dim nursing home room where I had expected to find an elderly woman tucked safely into bed, it did not look funny at all. She looked like something out of an old zombie movie. Pale, silent, shuffling, arms held strangely. And because I had already gotten that terrible feeling before I opened the door, the sight hit me much harder than it probably would have otherwise. I froze. For a moment, I just stared at her. I remember getting the same sensation you see in a frightened animal. Like every hair on my body wanted to stand straight up. The resident continued moving around the room. She did not seem to notice how bizarre the situation looked from my perspective. And I was trying to process one basic fact. During the daytime, she normally needed a walker. She was not someone I expected to see walking around independently. Yet there she was, at 3 in the morning, out of bed, shuffling around without it. My first thought was not even supernatural. It was more like, how is she doing that? Then she started moving toward me. That finally snapped me out of staring. She shuffled closer. I was bracing myself for her to say something strange, or maybe not recognize me at all. Instead, she looked at me and asked, "Is it time for bingo?" I do not know why that line made the whole thing even stranger. Maybe because it was so normal. Bingo was a daytime activity, a familiar thing. And here she was at 3 in the morning, wandering around her room in a way I had never seen before, apparently believing it might be time to go play bingo. The fear immediately changed. She was not some terrifying figure. She was an elderly resident who seemed confused. I started thinking she might not be fully awake. Maybe she had been asleep and gotten up without really understanding what she was doing. Maybe she was in some half-awake state. I am careful about calling it sleepwalking because I was not in a position to diagnose her. There are many reasons an older person might wake confused during the night. But whatever was happening, she clearly did not seem fully oriented to the time. It was 3 in the morning. It was definitely not bingo time. Once the situation became recognizable as a resident needing assistance rather than some impossible thing in the dark, I was able to respond normally. But afterward, I could not stop thinking about what had happened before I opened the door. That feeling. I had known something was wrong. Not specifically. I did not think. The resident is out of bed. I did not hear footsteps and consciously identify them. I did not see a shadow. But my body stopped me before I entered. Then I opened the door and found something completely outside the normal pattern I had learned during almost a year of working there. That is what made me wonder whether the cold feeling I had experienced other times was not always meaningless. Maybe I really did have some kind of spidey sense. Not supernatural necessarily, but intuition. Something in me might have noticed details before my conscious brain understood them. That idea is much more plausible than predicting the future. Humans take in far more information than they consciously notice. Tiny sounds, changes in airflow, movement, silence where there should normally be noise, a door positioned differently, a light, a smell, a subtle shadow under a doorway. Your brain processes all of that in the background. Sometimes it produces a feeling before it produces an explanation. Something is wrong. Maybe that is what happened outside the resident's room. Perhaps I heard movement inside without realizing I had heard it. A foot scraping lightly across the floor. Fabric moving. The bed frame making a small noise. Something that did not match the usual sound of a sleeping resident. My conscious mind ignored it. My nervous system did not. So I stopped. Then when I opened the door, I discovered the source. That would make the spidey sense real in a very ordinary way. Not psychic. Subconscious pattern recognition. The fact that I had worked there for nearly a year would make that even stronger. After hundreds of nights, I knew what normal sounded like. I might not have been able to describe the normal sound consciously, but my brain had learned it. Maybe every other night, when I approached that room, there was a particular hum, a rhythm of breathing, a slight movement from the mattress. That night, something was missing or different. My brain noticed the mismatch. I felt dread. That is one possibility. Another is that I simply got the feeling by coincidence. I have had that cold dread many times when nothing happened. If the sensation occurs often enough, eventually it will happen right before something unusual. That one successful match becomes memorable. All the false alarms disappear. This is something I have to consider. If I have felt something is wrong 100 times, and 99 of those times nothing happened, then the one nursing home incident does not prove I sensed danger. It may simply be the one time the feeling happened to line up with an unusual event. Memory is very selective about that. I do not remember every dark doorway that made me uncomfortable and turned out to be empty. I remember the one where something actually was different. That creates the impression that the intuition was accurate. Maybe it was, maybe not. The emotional force of the experience makes the connection feel stronger than statistics might justify. There is also the possibility that the resident being out of bed was not as impossible as it seemed. People sometimes do things at night that they do not normally do during the day. That does not mean they suddenly gain abilities they do not have. A person who usually uses a walker might still be physically capable of taking several unsupported steps, especially if confused and not thinking about safety. Needing a walker means the walker is important for stability and safety. It does not always mean the legs are completely incapable of movement without one. That distinction mattered. At first, seeing her walk without it felt almost supernatural. It was not. It was dangerous, yes, unexpected, definitely, but physically possible. Adrenaline, confusion, habit, or simply forgetting to use the walker could all contribute. Again, I would not try to diagnose exactly what happened to her. I only know she was doing something outside her normal routine. The posture of her arms may also have looked more frightening because of the lighting and my own fear. If she held them bent for balance, discomfort, or simply because that was how she was walking, the dim room exaggerated it. The word zombie comes from my reaction. She was not actually behaving like a horror movie creature. She was an elderly woman moving slowly in a dark room. But the human brain turns incomplete nighttime images into familiar categories. Pale person, shuffling, bent arms. Zombie, then she asks about bingo, and reality comes rushing back. I can laugh a little about that part now. At the time, though, my body had already decided there was danger. That likely made everything look worse. Fear sharpens some details and distorts others. Eyes search for threats. Faces look stranger. Movement appears more deliberate. You become aware of every sound. If I had entered the room in a completely calm state, maybe my first response would have been, "Oh, she's out of bed. I need to help her." Instead, I had stopped outside with a feeling of dread. So when the bed was empty, it seemed like confirmation. Then, seeing her in the dark escalated it. This is how expectation can build itself. Feeling, unusual sight. Interpretation, more fear. Then, once the situation becomes clear, the fear drops. The resident herself may have been entirely unaware that anything frightening had happened. From her perspective, she may have simply woken up and thought she was late for an activity. That contrast is almost funny. I am standing there feeling like every primitive danger signal in my brain has activated. She is thinking about bingo. Afterward, though, I began reconsidering all those other moments in my life when I had felt that same cold sensation. The dark doorway, the store, random places. Times where I could not explain why the atmosphere suddenly felt wrong. What if my body had noticed something every time? That is the thought that can become unsettling if you let it. Maybe I had walked past people who were watching me. Maybe there had been someone hidden beyond a doorway. Maybe something unsafe was happening nearby. Maybe I ignored cues that my subconscious had picked up. How many times had I felt the warning and simply told myself I was being silly? That idea is creepy, but it can also become a trap. If I start believing every unexplained feeling of dread is proof that a hidden threat exists, then there is no way to disprove it. Nothing happens. The threat stayed hidden. Something happens. The sense was right. That turns anxiety into evidence no matter what reality does. I do not think that is useful. A feeling is information, but it is not proof. Sometimes fear comes from real subtle cues. Sometimes it comes from fatigue, stress, darkness, an unfamiliar environment. A previous scary experience, a random physical sensation. The body is constantly making predictions. Many are wrong. The trick is not to ignore intuition completely, but not to treat it as supernatural certainty either. In the nursing home, the feeling led me to pause. That was harmless. If I feel uncomfortable near a dark doorway, there is nothing wrong with being cautious. If a person makes me uneasy in a store, I can create distance. You do not need paranormal abilities to respect a warning from your nervous system. At the same time, I would not look back at every unexplained chill and assume something terrible was hiding nearby. There is no evidence for that. The nursing home incident can be explained by subconscious cues or coincidence. Both are far more likely than some psychic warning. The most interesting explanation to me is pattern recognition. Working in one environment repeatedly teaches you details you never consciously memorize. A nurse or caregiver may enter a room and instantly feel something is different before identifying what. A mechanic hears an engine and knows something sounds wrong. A parent enters a child's room and notices the child is unusually quiet. An experienced driver senses another car is about to merge before seeing the turn signal. That can feel almost supernatural, because the reasoning happens below awareness. But the information is still coming through normal senses. Maybe that is what my spidey sense has always been. Not predicting something that has not happened. Not detecting ghosts. Just noticing little inconsistencies. A shape where there should not be one. Someone moving differently. A silence. A smell. An unusual sound. Then my conscious mind receives the conclusion before it receives the evidence. Wrong, leave, check, pay attention. If so, that would explain why some situations trigger it more strongly. Dark doorways provide incomplete information. Stores have many moving people. At work, I knew the environment well enough to notice tiny deviations. The feeling would be strongest where there is uncertainty or subtle change. That makes sense. But then why do I sometimes get it when nothing seems wrong? Because the system is designed to create false alarms. From a survival perspective, missing one real threat is much more costly than feeling unnecessarily nervous 10 times. Your brain sees something ambiguous in darkness. It would rather briefly prepare you for danger than assume safety. That is why people jump at coats hanging on doors. Why a shadow looks like a person. Why a sound behind you makes you turn. False positives are built into us. So I would expect the sense to be wrong often. That does not make it useless. It makes it cautious. The resident incident was one occasion where the alarm happened to correspond with something genuinely unusual. I also cannot know whether I truly felt the dread before receiving any cue. Memory can rearrange timing. Maybe I opened the door slightly and saw the empty bed before the full feeling hit. Maybe I heard the resident shuffle. Maybe some part of the door was already open enough for me to notice movement. Years later, the remembered sequence becomes cleaner. I knew first. Then I opened the door. That makes the intuition seem stronger. I remember stopping before opening it, but exact fractions of a second are difficult to reconstruct. The unusual sight may have influenced my memory of the warning. That is another reason to stay cautious. Still, even if the feeling happened only half a second before I consciously saw the problem, subconscious perception could account for it. The brain processes sensory information before conscious awareness.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
My mother was not an easy person to live with. Even saying that feels like an understatement. She had severe mental health problems, drank heavily, used drugs, smoked, and lived in a way that brought a lot of unstable people into our home. There were always things happening around her that children should never have been exposed to. She was known around the area for sleeping with different men and bringing strangers back to the house. Sometimes she would bolt the doors and bring people inside while the rest of us were there. There were also situations involving younger people being brought into the house that I did not understand properly as a child, and still do not like thinking about now. The house never felt completely safe when she was alive. She mistreated all of her children in different ways, but I seemed to get the worst of it because I looked the most like my dad. She hated him. And because I resembled him, some of that hatred seemed to get transferred onto me. When she had one of her episodes, I learned very young to disappear. I would rather sleep on the stairs beside our dog than stay exposed in my own bed. Other times, I would crawl underneath the bed and make a little nest for myself. Blankets, pillows, whatever I could fit under there. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but that was the point. She could not easily reach me. Under the bed felt safer than on top of it. That probably says everything about what living in that house was like. When people talk about childhood bedrooms, they usually describe them as a safe place. Mine was not. The safest part of my bedroom was the space where nobody was supposed to sleep. Under the frame, hidden, out of sight. Before my mother died, though, I do not remember anything I would call paranormal happening in the house. There were plenty of frightening things. But they were human. Arguments, footsteps in the hallway when I knew she was angry. Doors, voices, the fear of hearing her coming toward my room. Those things were more than enough. I never needed ghosts. Then, she died. Afterward, everything changed very quickly. People came into the house to sort things out and clean. My siblings and I were separated for a while. They went to stay with other family members. I chose to stay with my dad. For the first time in a long time, he was actually able to be part of our lives again properly. I stayed in that house with him for another couple of years. You would think that once my mother was gone, the place would finally feel safer. The person I had spent years hiding from was no longer there. There was no reason to crawl under the bed, no reason to listen for her, no reason to tense every time footsteps came along the hallway. But my body did not seem to understand that. And then I started hearing the footsteps. At night, usually when everyone else had gone to bed, I would hear someone walking in the hallway outside my room. They sounded familiar. That was what frightened me. They did not sound like random house noises. To me, they sounded like her. I knew those footsteps. I had spent years listening for them. When you are a child trying to avoid an unpredictable parent, you become very good at recognizing the smallest details. The speed of someone's walk, how heavily they put their feet down, which floorboards creak, how they move when they are angry. You learn to identify danger before it reaches your room. Those footsteps had been part of my survival. So after she died, hearing something that sounded like them immediately brought the old fear back. I would lie in bed and listen. Step, another step. Closer, then another. I would get out of bed and crawl underneath it, exactly where I used to hide when she was alive. I would stay there until everything went quiet. Only then would I climb back out and get under the covers. This happened enough that it became a routine. Hear footsteps. Hide, wait, return to bed. I knew she was dead. I knew she could not physically come into the room. But fear does not always follow what you know. My body had spent years learning those footsteps mean hide. Death did not erase that training. The sound alone was enough. There were other things, too. The bathroom door used to bang loudly at night. It could happen when everyone was supposedly in bed. A hard noise. Sudden. The kind of sound that makes you sit up immediately. Old houses make noises. Doors shift. Air pressure changes. Windows create drafts. Heating systems turn on and off. Wood expands and contracts. A door that is not properly latched can move enough to bang against the frame. I understand all of that now. But at the time, hearing a door slam in a house where I was already listening for a dead woman's footsteps did not feel like air pressure. It felt connected. Everything felt connected. Then there was the window. My dad and stepmother had converted my old bedroom into a storage room because it was the smallest room in the house. Nobody slept there anymore. That should have made it uninteresting. Just boxes and stored things. But whenever I went outside to play in the garden, I would sometimes look toward that window and see a shape. Always in that room. The room that used to be mine. The room where I had hidden under the bed. From outside, it looked like someone was standing there. Not necessarily a detailed person, more like a figure. A shape where I knew no one should be. I could see it from the garden, and every time, I would freeze. My dad and stepmother would normally be in the living room. From parts of the garden, they could see me. I knew where they were. I knew it was not them. That made the window worse. Eventually, curiosity would overcome fear. I would go inside, walk toward the old room. Sometimes it took me a long time to build up the courage. Then I would look. Nothing. Just storage. No person. No one hiding. No explanation that looked as convincing from inside as the figure had looked from the garden. Then I would go outside again. Later, I would see it again. That became another pattern. See shape. Know no one should be there. Work up courage. Check empty even now. I think the most likely explanation for that was something ordinary inside the room. Boxes, clothes, furniture, curtains, stored objects, lined up in a way that looked human from one particular angle. Windows are especially good at doing that because you are not only looking through glass, you are also seeing reflections, sky, trees, your own movement, light from outside mixing with darkness inside. A tall stack of boxes behind a curtain can look exactly like a person. Then you walk inside, and the lighting is completely different. The figure disappears because it was never a figure. At the time, though, I did not think that way. I only knew the shape appeared in my old bedroom after my mother died. That was enough for my imagination to do the rest. The strange part is that the only place where I really felt safe was around the corner of the house. There was a tiny strip of soil there, barely a garden. My dad gave it to me as my own little space where I could plant things. It was small enough that most adults probably would not have thought much of it. But to me, it mattered. My dad even stenciled my name onto the fence above it. That little patch felt different from the rest of the property. It belonged to me, not to my mother, not to the house, not to the memories inside. Mine, I could sit there and mess with plants and dirt and feel calm. It is strange how children find safe places. Sometimes it is a bedroom, sometimes a blanket fort, sometimes beside a dog on the stairs. For me, after everything that had happened, safety ended up being a tiny patch of soil around the corner of the house with my name painted above it. The rest of the house seemed to get worse over time, or at least that is how I remember it. People would come to visit and suddenly become angry. Arguments would start for reasons that did not seem important enough. Moods changed quickly. Someone would arrive perfectly fine, and then the atmosphere would become tense. The house itself seemed to affect people. At least that was how it felt. There were also strange temperature changes. Sometimes parts of the house would suddenly feel extremely cold, then later horribly hot. Not a comfortable shift. More like the whole place could never settle. Again, there are obvious physical explanations for that. Old heating systems, poor insulation, drafts, sun hitting one side of the building, rooms with different ventilation, doors opening and closing. A storage room may stay colder because it is not heated properly. Upstairs rooms become hot. Older British houses can have dramatic temperature differences even without anything strange happening. But when you already believe something is wrong with a place, temperature becomes part of the pattern. Cold room, footsteps, door bangs, figure in window. Visitors become angry. Everything gets collected into one story. The house is wrong. And maybe in one sense it really was. Not because of a ghost, because of what had happened there. There are places where years of fear change the way you experience every room. The hallway where you once listened for an abusive parent never becomes just a hallway. A bathroom door slamming is not just a door. A shape in the room where you used to hide is not just stacked boxes. Your nervous system attaches history to architecture. I think that matters more in my story than anything paranormal. When my mother was alive, I had trained myself to survive her. After she died, those survival responses did not disappear. So if an old floorboard sounded anything like her step, my brain did not first ask, could that be the heating system? It said, she is coming. Hide. That reaction would happen before conscious thought. By the time the rational part of my brain reminded me she was dead, I was already under the bed. That does not mean I consciously imagined the footsteps. The house probably did make noises. All houses do. The important question is what I identified those noises as. A creak can sound exactly like a step if you have spent years expecting steps. 2 or 3 creaks in sequence become walking. Pipes move. Wood shifts. Someone else in the house turns over in bed. A pet moves. A neighbor outside walks past. You hear a pattern. Your brain supplies the person you fear most. I knew her walk better than anyone. Of course, that would be the shape the noise took. The bathroom door can be explained similarly. If the latch was loose, a pressure change could make it move. Someone opening another door elsewhere in the house changes airflow. Wind hits a window. The bathroom door moves suddenly and bangs. If it happens once while you are already tense, it becomes frightening. Then, every later, bang reinforces the memory. The figure in the window may have been the same kind of effect, visually. A real shape. Wrong interpretation. The storage room was probably full of exactly the sort of things that create human silhouettes. Boxes stacked unevenly. Old coats. Furniture covered with fabric. A broom. Maybe one object sat in roughly the same position for months. That would explain why the figure appeared repeatedly in the same place. It did not move because the object did not move. When I went inside, different lighting revealed what was actually there. But because I was searching for a person, I may not have recognized which ordinary object had created the silhouette from outside. Then I went back to the garden. The angle returned. Person again. That can happen. The fact that I associated that room with my childhood fear would make the illusion even stronger. It was not just any window. It was my old bedroom. That mattered. The visitors becoming angry is harder to measure. When a family has been through instability, grief, separation, abuse, and major changes, tension is not surprising. Everyone carries something. My dad, my siblings, my stepmother, extended family, visitors who knew my mother. People may enter the house with memories and opinions before anyone says a word. A comment triggers something. An argument begins. Later, it feels like the house itself changed everyone's mood. But there may have been years of unspoken tension sitting underneath those conversations. Trauma can make households reactive. Small disagreements become large because nobody is really arguing only about the thing being discussed. They are arguing about everything that came before. That does not require a supernatural atmosphere. The house was already full of history. The temperature changes could also affect mood. A room suddenly too hot makes people irritable. Cold makes people uncomfortable. Poor sleep makes people short-tempered. If the house had bad ventilation or heating, the environment could genuinely contribute to arguments. Again, several normal factors can combine into something that feels almost intentional. The worst part for me was that my own episodes or fits became more frequent. I do not know exactly how to categorize those now, and I would not try to diagnose myself based only on memory. What matters is that I was getting worse. My dad and stepmother could see that. Eventually, they wanted somewhere with more space, more open air, somewhere that felt cleaner and calmer. So we moved, and I was relieved. I had spent enough of my childhood in that house, enough hiding, enough listening, enough looking up at that window. I had no desire to stay there and prove whether anything paranormal was happening. Sometimes leaving a place is the answer even when the reason is not supernatural. If an environment is tied to years of fear, getting away can help simply because the cues disappear. Different hallway, different doors, different floorboards, different shadows. The nervous system stops receiving the same reminders every day. That could explain why the house seemed so powerful while I lived there. It was not only a building, it was a map of things that had happened to me. The stairs where I slept beside the dog, the bed I hid under, the hallway where I listened for footsteps, the old bedroom window. Every part carried a memory. When people talk about haunted houses, they usually mean something dead stayed behind. Sometimes I think a house can feel haunted simply because the living remember too much. That does not mean the footsteps were imaginary. It means the house had enough ordinary sounds from my memory to turn them into something familiar. It does not mean the shape in the window was nothing. There was probably a real visual shape there. It means my mind identified it through the history of that room. I still understand why, as a child, I believed something might have remained after my mother died. Her presence had dominated the house while she was alive. She controlled where I felt safe. She determined when I hid. Her footsteps could change my entire behavior. Then suddenly, she was gone. But the house kept producing the same sounds. That must have felt impossible. The person was dead. The warning signs remained. From a child's perspective, one explanation comes naturally. She is still here. There is another possibility, too. My dad and stepmother may have been moving around at times. I thought they were asleep. Old houses transmit footsteps unpredictably. Someone downstairs can sound like they are outside your bedroom. A neighbor's movement can carry through adjoining walls. Pipes can knock rhythmically. Without seeing the source, I could never confirm. The fact that I hid immediately meant I did not investigate. That was understandable, but it also preserved the mystery. Hear footsteps. Hide. Footsteps eventually stop. Nothing seen. Repeat. I never reached the stage where I could stand in the hallway and discover that noise happens when the heating turns off. Or Dad gets up for water at this time every night. Because survival had taught me not to investigate footsteps. It taught me to disappear. That is probably why the pattern lasted. The bathroom door was easier to test. But even there, I doubt we were checking air pressure and hinges. We were living our lives. The house did something weird. We reacted, then moved on. That is how most hauntings develop. Nobody is running controlled experiments. The unusual events accumulate. Years later, they form a story. I also think grief may have affected everyone differently. Even if my mother had been abusive, death does not create simple emotions. You can hate someone and still grieve. Feel relief and guilt at the same time. Be angry they died. Be angry about what they did while alive. Miss the parent you wish they had been. Feel nothing one day and everything the next. For children especially, those emotions can be confusing. The person who frightened you is gone. You are safer. But part of your nervous system is still expecting them. That contradiction can be intense. It would not surprise me if my senses remained hyper-alert for a long time afterward. That is not weakness. It is conditioning. If a certain sound predicted danger hundreds of times, your body does not immediately unlearn the relationship because someone tells you the danger is gone. It takes time, maybe years. The figure in the window fits that too. I was outside, where I felt relatively free. Then I looked back at the house. My old room seemed occupied. The place I had escaped from appeared to be watching me. That image has psychological power, even if it was only storage boxes and reflection. No wonder it scared me. No wonder I kept checking. I needed to know the room was empty. Every time I went inside and found nobody, that should have reassured me. But then the figure returned later. That prevented full correction. There may have been one particular object I never identified as the cause. From inside, it looked harmless. From the garden, human, that could happen repeatedly for years. The little garden my dad made me stands out because it was the opposite of all that. It had no history with my mother. It was new. My dad gave it to me. My name was on the fence. I could plant things and watch them grow. It was a space defined by care rather than fear. I think that is probably why I felt safest there. The house was full of memories I did not choose. The garden was mine. Even now, that detail means more to me than the strange noises. Eventually, we moved, partly because my episodes were getting worse and because my dad and stepmother wanted a place with more open space and cleaner air. Whatever the exact reason, leaving was probably good for me. I never wanted to go back. I still do not. People live in that house now. As far as I know, life has continued there normally. Maybe the current residents never hear anything strange. Maybe the bathroom door was fixed. Maybe whatever shape stood in the storage room window disappeared as soon as the furniture was rearranged. Maybe they sleep peacefully in rooms that terrified me. That would not surprise me. A house can be one thing to one family and something completely different to the next. For them, it might simply be home. For me, it will always be the place where I learned to sleep under a bed because being visible felt unsafe. That history alone is enough to make me never want to return. If someone told me today that the house was genuinely haunted by my mother, I would still be skeptical. There is no clear evidence, no unmistakable apparition, no conversation with someone who could not be there, no object moving in a physically impossible way. Everything I experienced has plausible explanations. Footsteps can be building sounds. The bathroom door can move from drafts or pressure. The figure can be reflection or storage. Temperature changes can come from heating and insulation. Arguments can come from stress. My own worsening episodes can have many causes unrelated to the house. Nothing requires a ghost. And yet I would never tell the child version of me that the fear was foolish. It was not. She had spent years learning that the sound of those footsteps could mean something bad was about to happen. Then the person who made them died, and the sound apparently continued. Of course she hid. She did what she had always done. Under the bed. Wait, listen, only come back out when it is quiet. That is the part that stays with me. Not a ghost standing at the foot of the bed. Not some dramatic supernatural attack. Just familiar footsteps moving along a hallway where the person they belong to should never have walked again. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe pipes. Maybe my dad. Maybe memory turned every little noise into her. I think one of those explanations is probably right. But when you spend your childhood learning someone's footsteps, because knowing where they are can keep you safe, you do not forget that rhythm easily. And after she died, the house seemed to remember it too. That was enough for me. I left when we finally moved. I have never wanted to test whether the old sounds are still there. People can call it trauma, bad wiring, drafts, reflections, an old building carrying sound in strange ways. They may all be right. But if anyone living around Coton Hill in Shrewsbury ever ends up in that house and hears slow footsteps outside a bedroom door in the middle of the night, I hope they find an ordinary explanation. I never did. And after spending enough of my childhood hiding from the woman those footsteps reminded me of, I have no intention of ever stepping inside that house again to look for one. When I was in college, I started hearing knocks in my apartment. At first, they were easy enough to ignore. Apartment buildings make noise, pipes move, neighbors drop things, walls creak, heating systems turn on and off. I understood all of that, so the first few times I heard the knocking, I did not immediately think anything paranormal was happening. What made it harder to ignore was the pattern. Most of the knocks seemed to come from the wall directly behind my bed. My headboard was pushed up against that wall, so when I was lying down at night, the sound seemed extremely close. It usually started right around the time I was trying to fall asleep. A quiet knock. Then, nothing. A little while later, another. Then, another. The pauses would gradually get shorter. The knocking would become more frequent. Sometimes it seemed to get louder, too. It would build for a while, almost like something was becoming more impatient. Then it would suddenly stop. No final bang. No obvious sound of someone walking away. Just silence. The first few times, I probably told myself it was the building settling. That phrase covers almost every mysterious sound in an apartment. The building is settling. Okay, fine, maybe it was. But after hearing the same kind of sequence repeatedly, I started paying more attention. One night, I became irritated enough that I knocked back. Part of it was frustration because I was trying to sleep. Part of it was curiosity. If this was a neighbor on the other side of the wall, maybe they would react. If it was pipes or structural noise, obviously nothing would happen. I do not remember getting some dramatic answer immediately after I knocked. There was no clear back-and-forth conversation. But by then, I had already started thinking about the sounds differently. They did not always feel random. Eventually, I began separating them into two different types. In my head, I called them straight-line knocks and cluster knocks. The straight-line knocks were the less frightening ones. They felt almost indifferent. That is the best word I have for them. They did not seem directed at me. It was more like something was moving through a space, and every time it crossed something solid, there would be a knock. I realize how bizarre that sounds. I am not saying I literally saw an invisible object traveling through the walls. It was only the impression created by the timing and location of the sounds. Knock from one place, then another slightly farther away, then another, almost tracing a path. There was one incident that made that impression especially strong. I had a TV tray nearby, and at one point I felt what seemed like a knock through it. Not just heard, felt a small physical vibration. Then shortly afterward, I heard another knock from the entertainment center, then another from the wall above it. The positions seemed to form a rough, straight line. That was when I started thinking of that kind as something passing through the room. Again, there are ordinary ways vibrations can travel through connected objects. Floors transmit vibration. Walls transmit it. Furniture touching floors or walls can resonate. One impact somewhere else can seem to move because different materials respond at slightly different times. I know that now. At the time, though, it felt like I had experienced a path. The cluster knocks were different. Those felt intentional. Instead of moving through the room, they stayed concentrated in one area. Several knocks. Pause. Several more. Faster, sometimes stronger. The ones behind my headboard were almost always like that. Those were the ones that gave me the feeling that something was trying to get my attention. It is hard to explain why one rhythm feels mechanical and another feels deliberate. Humans are very sensitive to rhythm. 3 evenly spaced taps can instantly sound like someone knocking on a door, even if they came from pipes. An irregular group of impacts can seem impatient. A pause followed by another group can seem like waiting for a response. The brain naturally assigns intention to patterns. That may have been exactly what I was doing, but it did not feel that way when I was lying in bed listening to it happen. Then the knocks started happening at my parents' house. That was when the whole thing became much harder for me to dismiss. I went to college about an hour and a half away from home, and I returned to my parents' place most weekends. As far as I remember, I had never noticed the knocking there before it started in my college apartment. But once I became familiar with it at school, I began hearing it at home, too. Same general idea. Random knocking. Sometimes scattered. Sometimes clustered. Sometimes quiet enough that I could ignore it. Sometimes persistent enough that I could not. The cluster knocks at my parents' house usually did not build in volume the way the apartment ones sometimes did. They would happen sporadically, then become more frequent over the course of a couple of minutes, then stop. At that point, it really felt like the phenomenon had followed me. Different building, different town, same kind of noise. That idea naturally pushed me towards stranger explanations. If it had only happened in the apartment, I could blame the apartment. Bad pipes, neighbors, old walls, some mechanical system. But how could the same thing appear at my parents' house 90 minutes away? There is one very ordinary answer to that. Maybe the knocking did not follow me. Maybe my attention did. Before college, I probably heard occasional taps and knocks at my parents' house without caring. Every house makes them. Once the apartment noises became important to me, I started recognizing similar sounds elsewhere. Suddenly, a sound that would once have disappeared into the background became, there it is again. That would make it feel as though a new phenomenon had appeared when what actually changed was my awareness. It is similar to learning a new word and then suddenly seeing that word everywhere. It was always there. You just did not notice it. That explanation probably accounts for at least some of the experience. But then, one Sunday morning happened that I still have trouble reducing to background house noise. I was staying at my parents' place as usual. It was morning. I was asleep. Then the knocking woke me up. These were cluster knocks, but nothing like the quiet tapping I had become accustomed to. They were incredibly loud, violent. It sounded like someone was inside the wall beating on it with a hammer, not lightly tapping, not the occasional pop of wood. Repeated, hard impacts. I woke up immediately. For a few seconds, I just listened. The sound was coming from the wall of my bedroom, and it kept happening. Bang, 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 several impacts. Pause, then more. The intensity was completely different from anything I had heard before. I got close to the wall. I put my hand against it, and I could feel the knocks. Each one. That is the detail that made the experience much harder to write off as imagination. There was physical vibration in the wall. Something was producing a real impact strongly enough that my hand could detect it. That does not mean it was paranormal. If anything, physical vibration makes a structural or mechanical explanation more likely. But in the moment, it was deeply unsettling. Hearing something inside a wall is creepy. Feeling it under your palm is worse. It makes the sound physical. You stop wondering whether you imagined it. Something is hitting, shifting, vibrating, or transmitting force through the structure. The question becomes what? By this point, my brother already knew about the knocking. He was interested in some esoteric or occult adjacent things at the time, and he believed me completely. He had experienced some of the knocking independently as well. That mattered to me because I did not feel like I was the only one noticing it. My parents, on the other hand, had mostly been oblivious. Maybe they heard normal house sounds and ignored them. Maybe nothing had happened loudly enough around them. That Sunday changed that. The knocking was so intense that it woke everyone. All of our bedrooms were arranged along a short L-shaped hallway, so whatever was happening carried through that section of the house. My parents came into my room asking what all the noise was. For once, I did not have to convince them that something had happened. They had heard it. I told them it was not me. Then, I explained that I had been hearing knocks like this before, although never anywhere near this loud. My brother was creeped out. I was creeped out. My parents wanted an ordinary explanation. They decided the neighbors were probably doing some kind of housework. Hammering, construction, something like that. And to be fair, that is a completely reasonable first guess. Loud, repetitive banging on a Sunday morning? Neighbor with a hammer is not exactly impossible. But there were details that made me doubt it. First, the windows on the neighbor facing side of my bedroom were heavily insulated and closed. They blocked a significant amount of outside noise. That did not make it impossible for construction sounds to get through, especially low-frequency impacts, but the sound did not seem to be coming from outside. It seemed to be coming directly from the wall I was touching. And that wall faced the bathroom side of the house, not the neighbor's. I could feel the vibration through it. That made someone outside hammering feel wrong. But sound inside buildings can be extremely deceptive. This is one of the strongest ordinary explanations for the entire story. Impact noise does not always travel through air. It travels through structures. A hammer strike in one part of a building can enter framing, joists, pipes, or shared foundations and appear somewhere completely different. The place where a sound seems loudest may not be where it originated. If a neighbor was hammering against a structural element connected to our house somehow, the vibration could travel through framing and become strongest in my bathroom facing wall. The windows being closed would barely matter because the sound would not be entering through the windows. It would be traveling through the structure. That could also explain why I felt it. The wall itself was vibrating. The source could have been much farther away. Another possibility is plumbing. The fact that the wall was bathroom-facing actually makes plumbing more interesting, not less. Water pipes can produce surprisingly violent knocking. There is a phenomenon, commonly called water hammer, where sudden changes in water flow create pressure waves in pipes. A washing machine valve closing, toilet filling, faucet shutting, dishwasher, shower, any system that changes water pressure can produce knocks. If pipes are not secured properly, they can physically strike framing inside a wall. That can sound exactly like someone hitting the wall from inside, and you can feel it. The sound can occur in clusters as pressure changes repeatedly. One fixture elsewhere in the house can produce noise in a completely different wall. If the bathroom plumbing ran through the wall beside my bedroom, that becomes a very strong candidate. I do not remember anyone checking the pipes afterward. At the time, we were thinking, what is knocking? Not, which supply line is vibrating? So the practical investigation never really happened. Heating systems can do similar things. Pipes expand when they heat. Metal moves against brackets or wood. Radiators click. Ductwork flexes. Most of those sounds are smaller than what I heard that Sunday, but under the right conditions, they can be surprisingly loud. Temperature changes in the morning could also explain why it happened around a similar time. That became especially relevant because the next weekend it happened again. I was not home for the second incident. My brother told me about it later. According to him, around roughly the same time the following Sunday morning, everyone was woken again by extremely loud knocking. I do not remember whether he said it came from exactly the same bedroom wall, but the timing was similar. That repetition is one of the details that initially made it feel more intentional. One Sunday morning. Then the next Sunday morning, almost like something had established a schedule. But when I look at it now, repeated timing actually strengthens several ordinary explanations. People have weekly routines. Neighbors do chores on Sunday mornings. Laundry, repairs, cleaning, using particular appliances. Maybe someone nearby had a project they worked on during the same weekend hours. Mechanical systems can also operate on schedules. Heating, water use, someone showers at the same time, washing machine runs, dishwasher, sprinkler system, boiler cycles. If the source was human activity, Sunday morning recurrence makes perfect sense. If the source was plumbing triggered by that activity, same. A paranormal explanation does not gain special support from a weekly schedule when ordinary human life is already highly scheduled. I wish someone had investigated outside the house during the second event. Go next door. Listen, check plumbing. Turn faucets on and off. Flush toilets. Run the washing machine. Touch the same wall while testing different fixtures. That could have solved the entire thing. But nobody did. Like most strange experiences, it happened, everyone reacted, and then life continued. The intensity never returned after those weekends. I kept hearing knocks for some time, but nothing like the violent Sunday cluster. Eventually, even the smaller knocks faded, or I stopped paying attention. I am not completely sure which. That is another important detail. Nothing came from it. No wall opened. No hidden object was discovered. No person appeared. No message became clear. No escalating sequence led to some dramatic conclusion. There was just knocking, then less knocking, then apparently nothing for a while. It is anticlimactic. But that is also what real unexplained events often look like. They do not provide an ending. If it was plumbing, maybe something changed in the system. If it was a neighbor, they finished whatever they were doing. If it was heating, the season changed. If it was structural movement, conditions changed. No mystery needed to announce that it was over. It just stopped. The college apartment noises could also have had completely different causes from my parents' house. That is another possibility I think people overlook. Because the sounds felt similar, I assumed they were one phenomenon. Maybe they were not. The apartment headboard knocks could have been a neighbor. The TV tray vibration could have been floor resonance. The parents' house knocking could have been pipes. The loud Sunday event could have been a neighbor doing work. Years later, memory organizes them under one title, the knocks. But maybe there were several unrelated sources. That would explain why the behavior varied. Some moved in lines, some clustered, some increased in volume, some did not. Some happened at college, some at home. Instead of one mysterious force-changing behavior, maybe there were simply different noises that my brain grouped together because they all involved knocking. That explanation is not emotionally satisfying. One cause feels cleaner, but reality does not have to be clean. The headboard itself may have amplified ordinary sounds. A bed pressed against a wall acts like a contact point. If the wall vibrates, the headboard can transmit it directly into the bed frame. When you are lying with your head only inches away, tiny impacts sound much louder. At night, background noise is low. No traffic, no conversation, no television. Your attention is focused inward because you are trying to fall asleep. A small wall pop becomes obvious. Then you wait for the next one. The more you listen, the more noticeable every sound becomes. Sleep onset also matters. The period just before falling asleep can produce strange sensory experiences. People hear brief voices. Knocks, their name. A bang that seems extremely loud. Sometimes called hypnagogic experiences, they can happen while awareness is transitioning into sleep. That could explain some of the apartment incidents, especially because they often happened when I was going to bed. But it cannot easily explain the loud Sunday event because everyone heard that. There was clearly a real external sound then. So I would not use sleep phenomena as a blanket explanation. At most, they may account for some of the quieter nights. The fact that my brother also heard knocks independently at my parents' house makes a real environmental source likely there too. Again, shared experience does not prove a ghost. It proves something audible happened. That distinction is important. If 3 people hear knocking from a wall, there was probably a vibration or sound. The uncertainty is not whether the sound existed. It is what produced it. The straight-line knocks are still the hardest for me to describe without making them sound supernatural. The impression of movement was strong. 1 point. Then another. Then another, farther along. But structural vibration could reproduce exactly that. Imagine a pipe running behind several sections of wall. Pressure changes. The pipe contacts one bracket. Knock, then another section shifts. Knock, then a farther bracket. Knock to someone in the room, the sound seems to travel. Floor joists can do something similar. Wood responds to load changes. One joint releases tension. Then another. You hear a sequence across the structure. Something really is moving through the building in a sense. Stress, pressure, vibration, not an entity. The TV tray event may have been vibration through the floor. The tray legs touched the floor. The entertainment center also touched the floor or wall. A vibration passed through the structure. I felt it at one contact point and heard it at others. That explanation actually fits my original impression surprisingly well. I imagined something moving through solid objects. Maybe what was moving was mechanical energy. That would be much less dramatic, but physically real. The cluster knocks could also be pipes. Pressure waves often come in repeated impacts. A poorly secured pipe can hit framing several times before settling. Knock, knock, knock. Pause, more flow. Knock, knock. It sounds intentional because knocking is already a human communication pattern. Our brains are primed to interpret it that way. Someone knocks on a door because they want attention. So when a wall produces 3 taps, the question appears automatically. Who is knocking? The real answer might be nobody. The pipe is moving. One thing I am glad I did not do was build my entire life around the idea that something had attached itself to me. The fact that the sounds appeared in 2 places could easily lead there. It followed me. Then, if another strange thing happened somewhere else, that would become more evidence. Soon, every unexplained sound would belong to the same entity. That kind of interpretation becomes impossible to test because wherever I go, houses will make noise. Now I have recently moved near a cemetery, and I think I have started hearing similar knocks again. Of course, that immediately feels creepy. New place, cemetery nearby. Old phenomenon returns. It creates a perfect supernatural story. Whatever was knocking before has come back. Maybe the cemetery stirred something up. But I know I have to be careful with that connection. Living beside a cemetery does not mean unusual sounds or paranormal. The location itself makes me more attentive to creepy possibilities. A knock that would be ignored in another house becomes meaningful beside graves. That is expectation. And this time I already know the pattern. I know what cluster knocks sound like to me. I know what straight line knocks feel like. So my brain is ready to classify any similar noise. If I want to know whether the current sounds are genuinely unusual, I would need to treat them differently than I did in college. Write down the time, exact location, weather, heating or cooling activity, whether plumbing is running, whether neighbors are home, whether the sound happens at the same time repeatedly, whether anyone else hears it before I tell them what to listen for. If it happens in a wall, touch different parts and see where vibration is strongest. Check whether the root matches pipes or framing. If it repeats weekly, look for scheduled activity. That kind of boring information could solve something that otherwise becomes another 10-year mystery. The Sunday event at my parents' house especially makes me wish we had done that. 2 consecutive Sunday mornings at about the same time is a huge clue. At the time, it felt ominous. Now, I think it probably points toward routine. Somebody nearby doing something on Sundays. A plumbing event triggered by household routines. A heating cycle. Something mechanical. The fact that the second event happened while I was not there is also important. Whatever produced those loud knocks did not need me to be present. That weakens the idea that the phenomenon was specifically following me. If it was attached to me, why did it return to my parents' house when I was away? You could invent supernatural explanations for that, of course. It stayed behind. It affected my brother, too. It followed the family. But those are additions. The simple explanation is that the source belonged to the house or neighborhood. That may be the strongest clue in the whole story. My brother and I both noticed knocks there because the house itself produced them. The loud Sunday event repeated whether I was present or not. That is exactly what an environmental source would do. The college apartment may have been unrelated. Maybe I only connected the two because the first experience trained me to notice knocking. If that is true, then nothing ever followed me. I carried the pattern with me in attention, not the cause. That is much less frightening. But I still remember putting my hand against that bedroom wall. The hammering seemed to come from inside it. Every impact traveled into my palm. There is something deeply unsettling about feeling a wall knock back at you. It turns a familiar surface into something active. The wall is supposed to divide spaces. Bedroom on one side, bathroom on the other. Instead, it feels like something is trapped inside the structure itself. That was how it felt, not necessarily what was happening. I think that distinction matters throughout the entire experience. The straight-line knocks felt indifferent. The cluster knocks felt intentional. The Sunday knocks felt aggressive. Those are emotional descriptions. The sound itself may simply have changed rhythm, position, and intensity. My brain supplied motive. A pipe does not feel impatient. A wooden joist does not try to get attention. A neighbor does not know I am interpreting their hammering as something inside my wall. But humans cannot help reading behavior into patterns. That is why knocks are such effective horror material. They sit right on the boundary between ordinary building noise and communication. One knock can be anything. 3 in a row feels like someone. A pause feels like waiting. Then more knocks feel like a reply, especially if you knock back. I sometimes wonder whether knocking back made me pay even more attention afterward. Once you interact with a random sound, it stops feeling random. Now there is a relationship. It knocked. I answered. Then every later sound can be interpreted as part of the exchange. I do not remember a clear response that night, which is probably a good reason not to build too much around it. If there had been 3 knocks immediately after my 3, I would remember that strongly. Apparently nothing that definite happened. So whatever the source was, it never demonstrated actual communication. That matters. There was no code, no consistent response, no message, no intelligence proved itself, only rhythm. The other strange experiences I have had make it tempting to connect everything. My brother has his own experiences. There is another ghost story involving both of us. Those events make the knocks feel like part of a larger pattern. But I think each experience needs to stand on its own. One unexplained story should not be evidence for another. If I cannot explain the knocks, that does not make a separate ghost story more likely. And if something genuinely strange happened elsewhere, that does not make the knocks supernatural. Otherwise, every mystery supports every other mystery in a circle. The most grounded conclusion is that the loud knocking was real. Multiple people heard it. I physically felt vibration. It repeated the next weekend. Something in or around the house was producing force. I just never identified what. Plumbing is high on my list because of the bathroom-facing wall. Structural transmission from neighbors is another strong possibility. Heating or other mechanical systems are possible. The weekly timing suggests routine activity. The college apartment probably had its own source. Then, heightened attention made me recognize similar sounds when I went home. That explanation covers almost everything without requiring something invisible to travel 90 minutes between houses. And the new knocking near the cemetery does not change that. Not yet. A cemetery is an emotionally powerful location, but it does not alter how pipes, walls, or floorboards work. If anything, it makes me more likely to notice every knock. I still find the experience creepy. There is no reason I have to choose between creepy and probably ordinary. Both can be true. A house making unexplained hammering noises from inside a wall at Sunday dawn is creepy, even if the eventual answer is plumbing. Feeling those impacts through your palm is creepy. Having your whole family wake up and ask what the hell is happening is creepy. Then, hearing that the same thing happened the following weekend when you were not even there is creepy. The explanation can be mundane, and the experience can still be unforgettable. What bothers me most is that we never found the source. If someone had opened the wall and found a loose pipe, I probably would not think about it anymore. If the neighbor had said, "Yeah, sorry, I was working on cabinets both Sundays," same thing. Instead, nobody checked far enough. The knocking stopped before we needed to. So the question remained. Years later, Memory keeps the unexplained version. College bedroom. Knocks behind my head. Home on weekends. Knocks again. The strange feeling that they had followed me. The one time I could feel something seemed to travel from the TV tray toward the entertainment center and into the wall. Then, that Sunday morning. Waking to violent impacts. Putting my hand against the wall. Feeling each one. My parents coming into the room because, for once, they heard it too. My brother already knowing exactly what I meant. Then a week later, while I was gone, the whole house apparently waking up to the same thing again. After that, nothing dramatic. No apparition. No revelation. The knocks gradually became quieter and less frequent. Then they stopped, at least for a while. Now I live near a cemetery, and occasionally I think I hear them starting again. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe I am recognizing ordinary house noises because I already have a name for them. Maybe I will eventually discover a pipe that moves whenever the water pressure changes. That is what I expect. But every time I hear a few taps gathering in one part of the room, increasing slowly in frequency, there is still a part of me that goes back to college. I remember lying with my head beside that wall, listening. One knock. Pause. Another. Then several closer together, waiting for them to stop. And I remember that Sunday morning at my parents' house when the quiet little pattern I had learned to live with suddenly sounded like someone had picked up a hammer inside the wall and started trying to get out.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.